Hi, Amy. Well, we've just had a pretty fantastic chat with Lisa Weaver Swartz about her book
Did.
Stained Glass Ceiling. What was your takeaway from that discussion?
Oh man, there was a lot. My takeaway really is the power of the story that we're telling ourselves, in our cultures, recognizing what that story is. And I really appreciate how Lisa wasn't coming into this project for complementarianism or for egalitarianism, um, but that she really, I feel like, even was surprised herself in some things that she found as, I would say a more egalitarian person. Um, Problems with the culture at Asbury Seminary and the story that's being told there. But I think she did it in a way, both sides, in a way that hopefully we can examine ourselves and really start to think. And I really liked that about how we ended it with, the need to sit in this, not just to move to the next thing, or, even if we want solutions to this, that there's something to lament here, and there's something deeper to learn in all of this. And so I really appreciated how we concluded the talk as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I read the book, I had a lot of dissonance because I know people at both seminaries, faculty, students, and most of them, by and far, speak warmly of both places. And
Mm-hmm.
I just assume well, Southern's got they're doing that sort of complementarian thing, but you do you, that kind of thing. But looking at how it, I mean, there are some pluses for the women who play by the game in both institutions, Southern Seminary and Asbury Seminary. Um, and so I was struck by a little bit dissonance because I speak to people and they don't go around weeping and lamenting about how terrible it is, but as Lisa presses into both institutions, you can see some things which you can understand are a little bit unsettling. Well, in some
Mm-hmm.
cases, very unsettling, and that there, obviously, at Southern, it's dominated by the story of the conservative resurgence and how the liberal women
Right.
have been vanquished. But even at Asbury, this egalitarian place, it's still white male centered. It's still kind of rigged in favor of men. Not the least in the percentage of males who are who are on faculty. So I found it really really challenging, for
Mm-hmm.
me. But at the same time, it forces the kind of reflection that seminary administrators, whether they're complementarian or egalitarian, it gives us stuff we can all reflect on to make sure we're not centering everything on male experience, and we want to equip and empower women to go out and serve God, serve their families, and serve in whatever ministries
Mm-hmm.
they've been called to. So yeah, I found it a confronting book to read, and Lisa the discussion with her I just found was great because she explained everything and it came across. So I felt like I had a better appreciation of what she's trying to do. It's not trying to force everyone into a big guilt trip. It's
Right.
really, I think it's really just holding up the mirror to us and maybe
Mm-hmm.
showing the things that we did not see or we
Mm-hmm.
did not even want to see.
Yeah,
And
it definitely was a mirror.
I think that was definitely true. And that's the advantage when you have someone external come in, kind of pokes and
Mm-hmm.
prods around the place and interviews students and the like. So yeah, and I was wondering, what would that look like if it happened in my own,
Right,
seminary?
right.
What
Makes you
would
curious.
Yeah, what would that be? And that fills me with a bit of curiosity and a little bit of dread.
Yeah,
But
right. I like the
it,
fact too that she makes a point not to try to make this about taking power from white men to give it to everyone else over them, but this is a reciprocity thing.
mm,
So I think that is a fear a lot of the time when you read projects like this, especially if you are in the privileged side of things. You're thinking, well, now we're going to be the ones oppressed or
yeah,
something like,
yes,
that's what they want to do, and that's not freedom for anybody. So I thought that was a good point as well.
yeah, I agree. I agree. I mean, do you think? I mean, can you think of one reason why people should read the book, or what they'll learn from listening into the interview?
Oh man, I think that everybody should read the book no matter which side you stand on, because it challenges everyone. And I
Yep.
think that it's a very healthy challenge. And I hope that after the interview, people really come away thinking about the power of story. There's power behind that, and there's power behind who gets to tell the story as well. And I think a lot of the times we don't even realize that. We just think, oh, it's the gospel, but we don't realize, the subcultures and the stories that we are trying to fit into
Mm.
all the time.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, anyway, that's what's going to be happening. So hold on, listen in to our interview with Dr. Lisa Weaver Swartz about her book, Stained Glass Ceiling. Hope you enjoy it. Well, hello everyone. I'm Mike Bird, joined with my partner in gender equality crime, Aimee Byrd, and here we have a guest with Dr. Lisa Weaver Swartz from Asbury University. If I'm in Kentucky,
yes. You got it. Yes, which
where
is
my
not to be
favorite chicken
confused-
comes from.
what chicken is that? The
Well,
KFC or we were talking off air about
his unfavorite
Chick-fil-A.
chicken.
Which one?
Well, we only have Kentucky Fried Chicken here,
Oh.
but my favorite chicken actually is Chick-fil-A chicken. I mean, there's no doubt it's the chicken of heaven, chicken anointed with oil by the Lord Jesus, though probably not recommended by the American Heart Health Association. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. But Lisa, it's great to have you here because you've written as I would say, a cracker-lacking book called Stained Glass Ceiling. I found this book informative and challenging, and the worst part is, Lisa, I came into this book thinking I was an egalitarian champion of women. Now I'm questioning exactly how far my championness of women actually proceeds. So there was a lot of things to reflect on. Lisa, do you want to tell us how you came to the topic?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a sociologist of religion in my training and sort of field. And so I've always been, as in my research interest, concerned with, interested in religious communities and kind of the development of culture and identity within them. So sociologically, that, this project fits in really well there. But, I think in a lot of sociological work, there is always an element of autobiography too. And so there's, in some ways, I could also explain this project as part of my own attempts to understand my own experiences in faith communities. And I have had a lot of experiences in a variety of contexts. So in addition to my own tradition, and I'm Mennonite, and so I've had a lot of experiences across the board. There are many different types of Mennonites, but in addition to that, I've also had really meaningful intersections with Dutch Calvinists, Catholics, Pentecostal holiness, and now I find myself at a Wesleyan institution, which I do teach at Asbury University, as you mentioned, Mike. But I wanted to mention that it is a distinct institution from Asbury Seminary, which shows up in the book. So it's an unfortunate kind of similarity in language there, but because I've had all of these experiences in different religious communities and traditions, it's given me, I mean, maybe that says a lot about why I became a sociologist of religion in the first place. But just as I reflected on these experiences through sociological lenses, it's just become very clear to me how influential gender is and has been, not only in my own experiences in them, but in their processes, in the cultures that I experienced and saw other people working within. And so I think that was kind of the genesis in some ways of the project. And I have a lot of appreciation for all of those traditions and communities. I'm really grateful for the time that I've spent in them and learning from them. So overall, that kind of combination of experiences has been really a gift to me. But I've also had some really disconcerting experiences and even some painful experiences as a part of that as a woman in those spaces. And I should mention that my church experiences include both communities that are intentional about making sure that women are in places of leadership, as well as communities that are intentional about not allowing women to take positions of leadership. But my experiences, both positive and negative, really cut across all of those. So I think I knew going into the project that there was really more to the story of gender in the evangelical tradition or in the Protestant tradition than just that kind of theological language of egalitarian and complementarian.
Yep.
And I still kind of resist that language because it does say something to us, but there's just so much more to the story.
Yeah. I mean, does that sound true, Amy, that autobiographical experience can affect the way we view these issues?
That's kind of how I even became an author in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, do you find that remotely relatable?
Yes, I can very much relate with that. I call myself an accidental author because this really wasn't my trajectory in my mind, but just trying to make sense of my own experiences led me to writing in the first place. And what's really interesting about your project that you go to Southern Seminary and spend some time there and do some interviews there and kind of get into that culture and into the story that they're telling. And then you go to Asbury Seminary and you find something that I'm sure you were expecting in some ways already, but that even in its egalitarian stances, you still see this very this culture that's centered on white men and the challenges of the women in it. And so for me, coming from a reformed background and a very more patriarchal background, a complementarian background. And even as I'm interacting more in the egalitarian world, I've certainly made those same observations. So your book was very, you were like pinning down the very things that I was noticing. So I'm really thankful. And maybe we could get into now with both seminaries, kind of under this, because the thing that stood out to me in your book is just the power of a story, as you're entering into these cultures, how the community is oriented by the story that it tells and who gets to tell it. So maybe you could unpack that a little bit and we could start with your experience at Southern Seminary.
Yeah, Southern is masterful at its storytelling. I didn't go into this looking for narrative, but it just stood out to me. And at one point, this shows how naive I was going into it. But at one point, I was in the middle of interviewing the students at Southern. And I came home and I was frustrated and I was talking to a friend and I said, I can't really figure out what's going on here. All I hear is them telling the same story over and over. And as I said that, I was like, oh, okay. And so, so it's and the brilliance of their storytelling is that it fuses so many things. It fuses institutional history, the past of Southern Seminary, told through a very specific lens, and with chosen characters, with the biblical story, everything from the creation narrative all the way through the New Testament to the metaphor of Christ and the church. And in doing that, they've used the word gospel in a really powerful way to sort of bring everything together. And what ends up happening is that the kind of authority that the word gospel carries, it carries the authority of God himself, really. That carries over into the gender ideas that they are narrating along with this biblical authority. So it's really hard to it's impossible to disagree with, right? It is a package, and it's a very compelling package. Because in some ways, we can have our critiques of that, and I certainly do. But it's brilliant, right? Because it recognizes the need of, I think, humans to find ourselves in a story and to find some deeper meaning and connection point that we have to history, to people who've gone before us, and for those of us who value the biblical text, to find connection to the biblical text. So in some ways, it's quite a success story. but it does come with it. It is also a cautionary tale for those of us who kind of see the context and see a little bit beyond that, how they've constructed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like what do you think about how the story functions as a tool, even then, this longing that we all have to have this belonging, in a community, and yet these stories can then be a tool to kind of be boundary markers to decide who's in and who's out.
Yeah, and they are boundary markers in a lot of different ways. And I think you already mentioned sort of, there's a reason the stories are told in the way that they are told. It's coming from a particular perspective, it's building on, well, in some ways, generations of leadership, in some cases, newer leadership. And the people who are in control of institutional power and cultural power, they are the ones who have the authority to dictate how the story is told. And of course, that story is going to legitimate their power, right? Yeah. So it's very difficult to tell alternative stories within a framework that is so dictated by a leadership. And in the case of Southern, there are other stories, which was actually one of the most interesting parts of this project for me, was recovering. So I know a little bit about the Southern Baptist Convention just because of some of my previous experiences, but I didn't know a lot of the history. And so I was just learning about what Southern Seminary used to be, actually very welcoming to women, very forward thinking in terms of civil rights, racial issues. And even had a really thriving and wonderful social work school, which has all gone away, and none of that is a part of this usable history, the memory that's being narrated as our identity. And in its place, we do still have the founders, which I think is an important thing to note, that race is a part of this. The founders of Southern Seminary were enslavers, and they're continuing to be celebrated and venerated even as some of these others.
That was the thing that baffled me. I knew there was Boyce College, and I knew there's like a pro-slave Baptist. I did not know that Boyce was a chaplain in the Confederate Army and a slave owner. And like there's things named after him. Are there like pictures and statues of him, or?
Yes, there's. It's been a while since I was on campus, but in my last time I was there, there's the library, I believe, is named after him. There are likenesses scattered around campus. There's things like just even like more informal material culture, like mugs in the coffee shop. The buildings are named after Boyce and also the other three founders. So it's not as though it's history that's contextualized. The problems are lamented. Some of that has happened, I think, more rhetorically in kind of conversations, and I think there have been statements. But if you just look at the material and visual culture of campus and hear the official stories of the origins of the seminary, there's not a lot of lament that comes out for some of that past.
Do you reckon we could start a petition for them to rename it after Jimmy Carter? Do you think that would work? Because Jimmy
also Baptist.
Well, I'll be honest. I don't think he was a great president, but he was a great ex-president. Is the way that's the way I would describe Jimmy. That's the way I would describe Jimmy Carter. Not the best president, but he was the best ex-president. I don't know. Maybe Amy, we'll file that on our to-do list. See if we can get Southern Seminary to rename Boyce College Carter College.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get far on that one.
Yeah.
You might have just as much trouble convincing Carter as you do the college.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I was just like, with the stories, the story theme and the interviews that you were doing to kind of build on that theme and to show, like, over and over again, you were hearing the same story. One thing that stood out to me is how, sometimes when we talk about complementarian teaching and the implications of it and things like that, people will like to push back and say, well, that's just the fringe, like this isn't what most complementarians think. And, I have come to learn that this is what's being pumped out in the seminaries, and it's not fringe, and it's in their major resources, and just, but even so, and even with the most horrible things that I've been through in my own experiences, I'm reading some of this and I'm going, are you serious? Like, I opened it up here to page 57 because I wrote in the book and I said, this is also infantilizing. I can't take it. And this is the story of Charlie, who is a couple years in. His wife has to work full time to help ends meet. And so that kind of chisels into the story, right, of the provider, the masculine provider. So you quote him saying that, you know, he's kind of is making up for all this and putting his story together. And he says, I have the burden of knowing what's going on with the household. I'll give you a story to illustrate. My wife was in the elevator with some of her coworkers and they were talking about paychecks and stuff. And she said, I don't know how much I make. And they're like, what? And she said, my husband takes care of all that. And then they got closer to the bottom and they asked, didn't you bring an umbrella today? She's like, no, my husband didn't tell me I needed it. So even though she's going to work, there was still a headship there.
Yeah. Yeah,
what
a little
in
bit.
The world?
That's a bit. Can I please have an umbrella today? That sounds.
Well, she doesn't even think to ask because her husband didn't tell her that she needed one. And then later, further down the page, you said, Charlie even framed his relationship with his dog as an opportunity to exercise male headship. So I don't know. I mean, there's story after story. Like with this one was one of the more extreme ones I felt like, but
yeah,
it's like jab after jab after jab of trying to make the story fit.
Yeah.
Or to make yourself fit in the story.
To be fair, I do think I don't think that Charlie is representative of like your average Southern Baptist man in the pews right now, right? I think so. And this is one reason I chose seminaries, though, because they are religious communities, right? I got to look at the culture, I got to hear the stories, I got to see the formation and process, but they're also agents of culture and tradition. They're places where culture is being produced. And so in some ways, I do think you're right. It's not fringe, but I think it is in sharp relief, some of these things that I was seeing. But I don't think that takes anything away from the importance of looking at them and analyzing, because there is so much, it's so influential, especially Southern Seminary, because the voices that come out of there, they're so connected to the Gospel Coalition, to just so many of these other things that
and the future pastors.
Exactly. Yes. And they are taking these ideas out. And now in an age of social media, seminary grads, this kind of surprised me. I was expecting, that these seminary students would be preparing for congregational service, shepherding, discipleship, and they are. But so many of them are also cultivating social media followings. They are building their brands. They expect to be authorities in theology and culture. And so that's something that I'm still thinking about and processing the implications of that. But it does mean that even the Charlies, who are a little bit above and beyond, and maybe Charlie himself will even moderate as he grows and matures. I hope so. But I think they're important because these are the ideas that are filtering out and are just so influential.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I know the story of the conservative resurgence, which has provided a master narrative. It's kind of like, it's the same sort of, dare I say, narrative that Hugo Chavez would say about how he came to power. A kind of we vanquished all the evil capitalists who are exploiting our people in the country. It's a similar thing that when the time had fully come, God sent the conservative resurgence. And I mean, I thought my favorite quote of the book was Al Mohler as a living symbol of conservative masculine authority. Okay. I've met President Mohler, and he's definitely a big player in his part of the world. Yeah, I mean, I just thought that was, I thought that was just a fun description. I was thinking maybe kind of like a Southern Baptist Vin Diesel, something along those lines. You know, who's that? Who's that congressman with who's an army veteran with the eye patch? I mean, you know, the guy I'm talking about, Republican
I
guy.
can't think of the name.
I can't. Yeah, I can think of the face. I can't think. I mean, that I'd call him a living symbol of, you know, evangelical masculinity. I mean, the guy, he looks like a pirate. He's like a Baptist pirate. I mean, that's for me. But yeah, I mean, there is a sense in which complementarianism has been embedded into their view of the gospel, and then shaped within this wider narrative that we got rid of all these liberal women, and you know, and that was the salvation of not just the seminary, but of the convention. So, I mean, I found that very interesting, because I just thought it was kind of like background ambience. But from reading your book, the impression I got was it's like front and center, as to what is going on. Oh,
Well,
Yeah, at
before we
least when
move
I
to,
was doing my field work, it really was, yeah, front and center is exactly right. It's always, and even when it's not front and center, it's always, I would say, in the background.
Ah, cool. Well, I mean, do we want to switch now to discussing Asbury, or do you have any more questions about Southern, Amy?
one more. Okay, I just wanted to talk really briefly about, because I think this is important. You talk about the reward that comes to women who play by the rules. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, and unpack that a little bit, because I mean, I see that play out so often. And I know Tiffany Bloom talked a little bit about it in her book, Pray Tell, just about, you know, when people do speak out about misogyny or about bad messages in the church and things like this, you know, often there'll be women who come in and defend these doctrines. And she calls that the peak of patriarchy, you know, to have the women fighting for it. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about, you know, what you've observed with the rewards, you know, that there are rewards to women who play by the rules.
Yeah, for sure. And that phrase, the peak of patriarchy, that's a great one.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this I think this is one reason why these narratives and frameworks don't get assessed more often, is because there are women like you mentioned who are champions for these frameworks, and it's true. I mean, you said it so well, that there are rewards for playing along, for working within the system, and the system, of course, is to center men. And so if you find a way to do that, at Southern, and this works itself out at Asbury and other ways, but at Southern, being a wife to a powerful man is number one. If you are married to someone who is in leadership, there are all kinds of opportunities. And some of these wives, so Mary Moeller, the wife of Al Mohler, is a really good example of this. I met Mary on a couple of different occasions and kind of observed her in action. She is an incredibly competent, capable, impressive leader in her own right. And she manages the Seminary Wives Institute, which is a really, I mean, it is exactly what it sounds like. So there's a lot to unpack there too, but it is a really well-developed program that she has engineered and manufactured and runs and does all kinds of other things too. But it's because she is married to Al Mohler, and there are exceptions to this. There are some women, and Beth Moore is a good example of someone who is not married to a leader, a minister, someone who her husband is not in professional ministry, but she also played by the rules, right, in teaching to women. And that's where the opportunities are for these women, is in leadership of other women. But that, and it worked out well for Beth Moore until it didn't, right? Until she stopped following the rules. So I think she's a really good example of, you know, there are stark boundaries around what women, like what the opportunities are, and the rewards for women. They do come to a screeching halt when you stop following the paradigm.
Yeah, I'd like to press that point a bit. I must say, look, I know a lot of Southern Seminary faculty, ex-faculty, current and former students, and I mean, I know there are some people who kind of roll their eyes a little bit at some aspect, but they just play the game because that's the price of having a place at the table. So I know within the Southern Baptist world, but in the seminaries, there are some people who just, well, that's just the way it is, and we go along with it, even though there is a little bit of I'd say underground, but when friends from out of town visit, you find out what some of them really think. But I mean, I think it's interesting that the fact that Beth Moore left, and recently, I think in just like within a week, we've seen Karen Swallow Pryor also leave Southeastern Seminary. And Southeastern is, from what I found, one of the seminaries that I thought was a little bit was friendlier to women relative to the Southern Baptist context. That's my experience or intuition. But even Karen Swallow Pryor now finds that Southern Baptist institutions are not a good place for women who are willing to, question things on, I think it's not just like religious doctrine, but even kind of the political cultures that they're involved in. And I thought that was very interesting. So it's not just a matter of these are our beliefs. It's now also enmeshed in a particular culture and a particular political orientation that is now embedded within these institutions. And I mean, as an outsider, because we don't quite have that same thing. Like I've got colleagues at work who are kind of like flat out greenies. So and then we've got a very big political spectrum in the places where I work, and certainly in our churches where I find it's a little bit more monolithic. Do you think we're going to see an exodus of capable women from the Southern Baptist Convention, which I think would be to their detriment? But do you think there's going to be a women who say, you know what, I've played the game, but I'm not playing it anymore? Is the dam about to burst? Do you think, Lisa?
That's an interesting question. I think it's going to be very difficult for the dam to burst because all of those women who are perhaps feeling that way are tied to husbands. And in this paradigm, you don't leave a denomination that your husband is still in. I don't think that would, I mean, I'm sure there will be isolated cases where that does happen, but the family unit, even the male headship, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I could be wrong, but I think it's going to take men being fed up with it before there's that mass exodus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And, I should say too, there are other rewards for women in this paradigm, even those who are not in the high profile positions like Mary Moeller. The Seminary Wives Institute that I mentioned, I spent quite a bit of time observing in those spaces. And what I observed was a lot of really valuable nurture and caregiving and identity development for the women who are in them. And of course, you could argue that they need that because of the patriarchal power structures that are disempowering them and keeping them from, speaking into theology and political frameworks. But there are some real advantages there's some underground benefits, I would say, too, even for women who are not in leadership. Yeah. So your question is a great one. I think as we learn more about the scope of some of the abuses and the power struggles within the SBC, I anticipate that we'll see some changes. I don't know what those will look like yet, but I will also be very curious to watch.
Okay. Well, we should probably then move on to discussion of Asbury Seminary, which is also in Kentucky.
Yes.
Am I correct?
Yes, it's actually in the same town where the university where I teach, which also makes it complicated.
Okay. Well, as Amy can tell you, my knowledge of American states can get a little bit confused. I can never remember whether
understandable. You are in Australia.
Yeah, I can never remember whether Amy's in Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, or Maryland.
Maryland.
Just the whole sort of that mid-Atlantic coast is a bit of a blur for me. But so you've sort of also done a study of it, and I thought this would be, well, obviously, Asbury. I mean, if Southern Seminary is the Darth Vader of the story. Obviously, Asbury is the Luke Skywalker of the story. And we have complete and utter gender equality for women. All the women are empowered. It's complete, utter equality, and everything is really good for women. That's what I was expecting, the juxtaposition. But that's not what happened, Lisa. And there was some other things, like if you've got Southern's gendered gospel, Asbury's gender blind individualism, can be a little bit stacked against women as well. And you noticed that women at Asbury are still sort of expected to embody certain types of femininity, and there are certain expressions of female attributes and character that can be threatening threatening, or maybe destabilizing would be a better word. Can you tell us briefly the story of Asbury Seminary and its sort of gender philosophy, logic, culture, or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, so in striking contrast to Southern's practice, Asbury is very intentional about trying. So first of all, women are welcome and encouraged to enroll in all of their programs, including the Masters of Divinity, and to pursue ordination in their denominations. And there are a lot of women who are on faculty. Oh, I shouldn't say a lot, because they are outnumbered, but the institution is intentional about trying to hire women to be in these positions of influence and authority. And it builds itself as an egalitarian institution and really foregrounds that as a part of its identity, which goes back. It's part of the Wesleyan tradition. It's always it's always been a part of at least the cultural ideals of the seminary. And so in contrast with Southern, where there's only men in front, in the pulpit and in theological teaching positions, one of my first experiences at Asbury was in a chapel service that was presided over by a woman. Their dean of the chapel, which is basically the campus pastor, is a woman. So she, did all the things that you do. She did the preaching, presided over the Eucharist, which is a really important part of the Asbury's community. So there are these embodied models of women leading and serving in churchly and leadership capacities. But you mentioned the gender blindness. It took me a while to figure out what was going on at Asbury, even more than at Southern, because they have this identity as egalitarians, but in the community, they really don't like to talk a lot about gender. And the exception to that is, again, a story. They're very, very interested in talking about the New Testament and the New Testament context that Paul especially was writing out of. So they're very, very eager to explain the barriers to women leading in places like Corinth, and how Paul and Jesus were very subversive in what they taught about women, which really radically frees women is the language that they like to use. But the same students who were really articulate about the biblical context and the freedom of women in the New Testament, they just had very little to say about women in contemporary society and the barriers that they might face here, and their own had very little ability to reflect on their own community and processes. And I think as a consequence, a lot of the women struggled. They really enjoyed their time in the community, and almost without exception were grateful for a lot of what they found, but had insecurities they couldn't quite put their finger on. One of them told me that she was used to being in male-dominated spaces and classrooms, but she found herself just unable to speak in her classes, and she just said, "I never raise my hand. I never contribute to the conversation, and I can't quite figure out why." It bothered her, but she couldn't really put her finger on it. And so I argue that this gender blindness, that they're not, the community is not looking at and articulating women's experience, looking at what it means to interpret the Bible as a woman, or to pursue discipleship as a woman. That essentially what happens is a version of what happens at Southern, that women are rewarded for accommodating to these spaces that have been largely defined and manufactured by men, and so there it's a difference because women are leading and they are at the table, but culturally it's there's still a lot of barriers and a lot of bewilderment and I think disempowerment that and pain really that is going unnamed.
Okay. No,
yeah, I find that really interesting because so often we don't think that we are in a culture, you know. We just take the water that we're in like that's what is normal or whatever.
Culture happens to other people. Yeah,
culture happens to other people, and we'd love to invite more culture in, right? But we don't recognize the culture that we have, and we don't really allow for the other cultures to intermingle very well. We want them to assimilate to us. And so I think that you really, in your book, Lisa, you just really, I felt like illustrated that you're still in this world that is saying, and you know, you see this with race too so much. Oh, we're colorblind, you know, oh, we're gender blind. And so then that means we have to ignore the fact that, you know, we have to normalize the male perspective in everything, you know, and the male masculine leadership styles and the white leadership styles and mannerisms and our voices kind of are just supposed to sound like your voices, and so there's nothing distinct and valuable about the female voice that's contributing, and there's nothing distinct and valuable about other ethnicities' voices coming in and contributing, and so I think that's really important, and I thought that you really did a good job of revealing that, because it's so easy to be like in one camp or the other without really saying like we all have growth to do here, and there's a lot more voices. It's like in one sense we don't want to use othering language, right? Because we don't want to make someone look outside, but then there is something valuable about other language. I'm starting to pick up on myself. I mean, it makes, you know, that's what makes something worth loving, is its uniqueness, its otherness, you know, than our own. So I don't know, what are some ways that you think that we can address? I mean, it just seems so mountainous and so hard to address.
I think we'll come that to the end, because I want to talk about Lisa's solutions at the end. We will get there, but I want to share what was for me was the most confronting paragraph in the book, which for me was on page 155, and I'll read it. One of the great this is your words, Lisa. One of the great entitlements of being an egalitarian man is to declare, "I support women in ministry." This affirmation is not, of course, disempowering to women. In fact, within the evangelical subculture, it powerfully signals rejection of complementarianism. But the declaration's clarity is deceptive. By itself, it fails to acknowledge the constraints that frame women's lives, nor does it suggest that women's knowledge and experience should actively shape biblical interpretation, leadership structures, and liturgies of worship. It can uphold a gender blindness that structurally and culturally centers men. Whether this gender blindness is a cover for white masculine hegemony or simply the consequence of good-hearted Christians limited by history and cultural toolkits, the result is the same. And this is the real money quote. In the end, Asbury's gender blindness comes with the same caveat as Southern's promises of complementarian flourishing. It is available to women to the degree that they are willing and able to cooperate with the constraints of stories that center men. That was like a dagger in my
starred
heart.
and underlined on there.
I thought I was the good guy. I was the guy with the white hat who comes in and speaks up for all the oppressed women. But I'm starting to think I'm maybe a little bit gray rather than all white. Aimee, please tell me I'm the good guy. I want to be the good guy. I thought I was the guy.
I'll just quote Lisa. Men's intentions are not all that matters.
Whoa.
You're making me sound so mean.
Whoa.
Well,
I
I
mean,
think that's something that we all need to look at, right? Like I know that with all of the minority voices in the church, we need to look at, here's our intentions, this is what we want to be, but what are we not seeing, you know? And
but
I thought you did a really good job of holding up a mirror and saying, okay, here are the stories and here are the struggles in them.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then, the good guys will be like, oh, instead of being defensive and this one really hit me, what can we do here?
Well, it was, and it's as a sort of egalitarian man, it's confronting and challenging, hopefully in a good and transformative way.
Right.
Like I'm egalitarian. I always throw my dirty washing as close to the laundry basket as I can. I mean, because I care, But maybe that's a joke. But maybe that joke is actually symbolic of the actual problem. And one thing you do mention, like, oh, Amy, do you want to talk about the second shift?
Oh, yeah. I mean, come on. That is just, you nailed it, Lisa. And she's just talking about how, even those who are like all for women's rights and the husband who's all for women's rights and everything, but then the woman comes home from, doing her outside vocation, and then she comes home to the second shift of, managing the household and all of the intricacies of that. So yeah, that's kind of the silent work that gets done.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Should we go on and talk about Lisa's solutions for both issues? Now,
Before we do that, could I interject one thing?
Sure thing, Lisa.
We've been talking a lot about all the problems for women and how bad these things can be for women. But I think we need to point out too that this isn't doing white men any favors either.
Yeah.
I think one of the saddest things for me was interacting with these white male American seminary students who just could not see beyond their own experience and were not equipped to problematize their own experiences and see through the eyes of others. And that's just not, nobody's winning. This is not, this is not something that is,
such a good point.
disempowering to women to the advantage of men. I really resist that. I don't think anyone is winning here. And I think especially if the church wants to, and I think, I mean, maybe, yeah, I know, I think it's fair to say, I think the church does want to minister, to serve a world that is deeply divided, that has a lot of different perspectives in it, a lot of different experiences. There's a lot of inequality and suffering. And if we want to speak into that, if we want to bring hope and healing, we have to be able to see outside of our own experience and to problematize what we see in the world. And so I actually think that the women in these contexts are ahead of the men because they're able to do that. They're forced to do that. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so motivated to push beyond that is not for the sake of the women, it's for the sake of the men. So this is a both and argument that I'm making.
Yeah, and the whole community, just to make the church such a more fructifying community. I like that.
Cool. Excellent point. Well, I mean, let's talk about the solution. When we got to the conclusion, I was thinking, so what's the solution to this? I thought, is Lisa going to suggest we should do to Southern Seminary what General Sherman did to Atlanta? Should the women at Asbury, divorce their husbands, abandon their children, move to Portland, get a neck tattoo, and set up a vaping store? I mean, what's the solution here? And I was a little bit curious as to where you're going to go with this. But I thought the solution you offered was things like reimagining motherhood, and not simply as the Patriarchal Support Act was good. I like the idea of involving wider tools. Things like knowing things like as simple as, I mean, a bit of history, maybe of your own denomination, where that's relevant. Things like sociology. I also liked the thing about global perspectives. And, one thing I'm big on is, whenever you're facing a sort of, difficult situation, I think you need to dig down into the tradition, beneath you to see what our forefathers and foremothers in the church have said, but you also need to look around the global church to kind of, gauge what their opinions are on the topic. And then you also gave stories of resistance. And I like the way it ended with the sort of, vignette about Beth Moore. So I kind of, you weren't presenting the worst case scenarios I was imagining. I thought, oh man, what's the solution going to be here? I thought, I mean, is that an adequate summary of, I feel like I'm doing my book review report here with the author. Is that an accurate summary of what you think the solution is, both to the gendered gospel of Southern Seminary and the alleged gender blindness of Asbury?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely summary. It's so, I mean, this is such a big problem. It's hard to identify discrete and easy. There are no easy solutions, right? But I think that, I mean, you picked up on a couple of things that maybe I'll expand on just a little bit. I think the number one thing that I've been coming back to since the book has been out and I've been processing it is that I would really like to see everyone stop trying to solve stop trying to solve sociological problems with theological tools. I think there's so much history and context in these spaces, and it's clearly good theology is not enough, or theology is not enough. Both of these systems of theology are well developed, internally coherent, but they're missing so much human experience, so much context. And I think just looking at these two seminaries, and I think what I know of other evangelical seminaries, this isn't true across the board, but they're not encouraging disciplines outside of biblical studies, theology. There might be a class or two on social science methods or the history of the church, but I think the church itself needs to be accountable to, and you said it so well, Mike, the past, the mothers and fathers that have come before us, those who are around the world, other theologies even. That emerge from other experience, indigenous theologies, womanist theology, even if it's outside of the tradition. And I don't know how that works itself out organizationally. I mean, there are reasons why seminaries themselves want to sort of monitor how much breadth there is in the doctrines that they're teaching. But I think that's part of the problem that I'm seeing is we're trying to construct systems of ethics, processes of decision making, authority structures. But all of the people who are doing these things are trained in seminary context by seminarians through theology, and so I think that it's a big ask, but I would like to see more accountability of the theological discipline itself to some of these other ways of thinking and processing. So. I don't know how much of a solution that is, but maybe an avenue for optimism. And I really am optimistic. I think, as you said, the book is a tough one. There's a lot of hard things that I didn't even expect to find, but I find myself at the end, and maybe it's because the sociological tradition does sort of have this instinct that we identify the problems so that we can solve them. And once we know what the problems are, that's great. That's a good step in the right direction. But I think, so the question of next steps that you've asked, I've gotten a lot of different versions of that, mostly from pastors and other religious leaders since the book has been out. And in some ways, I am formulating these ideas and thoughts about accountability. But in some ways, I do find myself kind of resisting that question in some ways. And I think part of the reason is that as people of faith who are still invested in the institutions of the church, I think there is a temptation to sort of think, well, if we just find the problems in our theology, if we just tweak our theology, or if we just try a little harder at representation, at getting women and people of color into these positions of authority and leadership, or whatever it is. Recently, we've seen on Twitter the conversations about publishing and how to vet publishers or vet publications and tighten the process of endorsements and things. And there's all these things that we could do. And I think there's a temptation to expect that if we do those tweaks, that we will get back to the real Christianity that's pure and holy, and of course would never have these problems. And I know. And I want all those things to happen. Those are all good things. I want better theology. I want representation. But the fear is that those emphases can so easily become distractions that can keep us from acknowledging that our cultures and even the processes toward those really good changes so often look more like empire than they do like the kingdom. And so I do want to see progress. I do think that is very possible. And I'm like I said, really optimistic. But I think before we jump into those solutions, first we need to just sit with some of the things that we are learning about some of these breakdowns in our cultures, in our processes. And there's a lot of harm that has been done, a lot of wounds. And I think listening to people on the margins, just sitting with the fact that we are not perfect, that there is there's no perfect church, right? There's no tradition out there that doesn't need to be repenting of something. And so if we can sit with that, and I think there are gifts in repentance and in lament. So I think that's my number one right now, where I would really like to see things start. And then we can get to, the solutions and processes. But I think especially in this season of Lent, it seems like an appropriate place to start.
Yeah. That does sound good. Well, I mean, Amy, how about we give the final question to you? I think one more question for Lisa.
I think we've solved all the world's problems with that last answer. I mean, I'm just really thinking as you were talking, Lisa, about the lament that needs to happen in time for that. We need to die lots of deaths in some ways, but then have expectation that God will do something with that there'll be little resurrections everywhere as well. So I think that I really resonate with what you're saying there, that we can't just turn it into some formula, and particularly even a theological formula, where it's still the institution running things. So I really like that.
Well, that's probably a good thing. Maybe contrition is the precondition for transformation. That's
there's grieving that needs to happen.
I think that's true, and certainly, everyone needs to have a little bit of, whether you sit on the complementarian egalitarian divide. I mean, some people, are not going to change their views, but they can change the way they express their views and be more mindful of the consequences, and seek to, diminish what might be the negative side of what they do. But hey, that's just
the ability to say that we're all telling a story, and we think that it's just the one story, the gospel, right? Like, and so then we make our story the gospel. But to be able, this is a challenge. Your book is a good challenge, a healthy challenge to look wherever we are, whatever institution, whatever denomination, whether it's complementarian or egalitarian, to look at the story that's being told, this narrative that's going on, that we're having to kind of keep the hustle with.
That's exactly right. Good. Well, that's probably a good point to end on. The book is Stained Glass Ceiling: How Evangelicals Do Gender and Practice Power. Should be at Amazon.com and the usual places. Lisa, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your work. Confronting it sometimes was, but regardless of whether you're egalitarian or complementarian or still figuring out your views, this is a book that challenges everyone. No one gets off scot-free in this book, and that's the best thing. And I think everyone should read this and have a deep reflection of it, particularly people who are involved. Like I'm a dean of a seminary, so this is certainly something that's very important to me, and something I know I've got to consider when I consider the welfare and the training of female students. So thank you very much for writing this book, Lisa.
Thank you. This has been a delight.
Oh, same for me. I was really looking forward to this talk.
Oh, good. Excellent. Okay. Well, to everyone watching, thank you, and we'll catch you next time. Another episode of Birds of a Feather.